There is a specific moment in the narcissistic dynamic that Jung identified as the most structurally significant transition the relationship ever undergoes. Not the moment the empath decides to leave. Not the moment the empath finally names the pattern. Not even the moment the empath stops responding to the behavioral scripts that were so reliably effective for so long. The moment the empath finds their voice. Not voice in the simple sense of speaking up. Not the installation of verbal limits or the development of more assertive communication patterns or the ability to articulate in calm and measured language what will and will not be accepted. Something more fundamental and more threatening to the narcissistic structure than any of these. The specific voice that arises when a person has completed enough of the individuation process to speak from their own center, rather than from the periphery of another's psychological world. The voice that carries in its quality and its content and its simple undefended presence, the sound of a psyche that has returned to itself. That knows what it knows. That has named what it has seen. That can speak the truth of its own experience without immediately organizing that truth around the question of what the narcissist will do with it. Carl Jung spent his career documenting what the voice sounds like and what it costs the narcissistic structure when the empath finds it. What it loses. Not merely the practical ability to continue certain behavioral patterns. Not merely the tactical advantage of an empath who doesn't name what they perceive. Something more structural than that. Something that, once lost, cannot be recovered through any means the narcissistic structure possesses. This video is about that loss. About what the narcissist loses when the empath finds their voice. About why the voice is so specifically, so precisely, so existentially threatening to the narcissistic structure. And about what it means for the empath who has found it, or who is in the process of finding it, to understand exactly what their voice does. To understand what the narcissist loses when the empath finds their voice, we have to begin with what the silence was providing. Not the empath's silence in the strategic sense, not the deliberate withholding of communication as a response to the narcissistic dynamic. The silence that matters here is something deeper and more pervasive than that. It is the silence of a psyche that has organized itself around the needs and the version of reality of another person, so thoroughly that its own experience has no voice within the relationship. Jung called this the silence of participation mystique. In the state of participation mystique, the empath's inner world is not absent. It is not empty. The empath continues to feel, to perceive, to know things about what is happening in the dynamic that are accurate and significant and worth attending to. But these feelings, these perceptions, these knowings, they do not find voice. Not because the empath is incapable of speaking, but because the entire psychological orientation of the participation mystique state is organized around the other person's reality as the primary reality. The empath's experience exists, but it exists in a position of secondary importance, perpetually evaluated against the question of how it will land, what it will produce, whether speaking it will be worth what it costs. And in a relationship with a narcissistic structure, the cost of speaking one's own experience has been consistently demonstrated to be high. The empath who speaks what they perceive is told they are wrong about what they perceived. The empath who names what they feel is told the feeling is disproportionate. The empath who articulates what they know is told the knowing is the product of psychological limitation. Over time, through the accumulated experience of having authentic expression consistently met with denial, reframing, or the narcissistic structure's authoritative version of what actually occurred, the empath's voice becomes quiet. Not silenced through force. Quieted through the gradual experiential learning that speaking from one's own center produces consequences that are not worth the cost. And this quieting, this learned suppression of authentic voice, is not merely a communication pattern the empath has developed. It is the primary condition the narcissistic dynamic requires to function. Jung was precise about why the empath's silenced voice is so operationally valuable to the narcissistic structure. The narcissistic structure, as Jung documented, is organized around the continuous, urgent management of its own projected shadow. The disowned aspects of its psychology, the inadequacy, the dependency, the void, the unintegrated pain, cannot be acknowledged within the narcissistic structure's conscious identity. They must be externalized, projected outward onto an available container. The empath is that container. But the projection does not simply deposit shadow material in the empath's psychological system and move on. For the projection to be effective, for the shadow material to remain externalized rather than returning to the projector, the container must not name what has been deposited. If the container names the projection, if the empath says clearly and from their own center, "I see what is being placed here and it is not mine," the projection loses its primary mechanism. Because the projection operates in the space between the deposited material and its recognition as externally sourced. As long as the empath absorbs the projected inadequacy without naming it as projected, it functions as a genuine statement about the empath's character. The empath is inadequate. The empath is confused. The empath is the one who is not seeing clearly. The moment the empath names the projection, the moment their voice speaks from their own center and says clearly and without drama, "This is not mine, this belongs to where it came from," the projection is disrupted. Not destroyed immediately, not resolved in a single act of naming, but fundamentally disrupted. The mechanism through which the projected material was being maintained as a statement about the empath, rather than as a statement about the narcissist, has been interrupted. And the narcissistic structure, encountering this disruption, encounters something its entire architecture was organized to prevent. The named thing. The scene mechanism. The experience that has been given voice. What does the narcissist actually lose when the empath finds their voice? Jung's framework allows us to map this with precision. The first thing the narcissistic structure loses is the primary projection surface. The empath whose voice is silenced is, in the most precise psychological sense, available as a container in a way that the empath whose voice has been found is not. The silenced empath absorbs, not because they are psychologically weak, but because the specific orientation of participation mystique, the organized around the narcissist's psychological stance that the dynamic requires and reinforces, makes absorption the default. The empath's own experience does not have sufficient voice within the dynamic to interrupt the absorption. The projected material lands, and in the absence of the empath's own perspective to contextualize it, it is taken on. The empath who has found their voice carries a different relationship to incoming material. Not a defended relationship. Not the hardened, closed-off stance of someone who has decided to never absorb anything again. But a conscious relationship. A relationship in which the empath's own perspective, their own felt sense of what is theirs and what is not, their own clear perception of the dynamic as it is occurring, is present and available and capable of being spoken. And the presence of this perspective changes what projection can do. The projection arrives. The empath's voice, internal first, then potentially external, names what is arriving. This is not mine. I see where this is coming from. I recognize this pattern. And in that naming, the absorption is interrupted. The projected material, encountering a container that can speak its own experience, cannot complete the mechanism it requires. It cannot become the empath's inadequacy, the empath's confusion, the empath's psychological limitation, because the empath has spoken, and what they have spoken is the truth of their own experience, which is something the projection cannot survive. The second thing the narcissistic structure loses when the empath finds their voice is the ability to maintain the alternative version of reality. Jung observed that the narcissistic structure's relationship with reality is not merely self-serving in the ordinary sense of human bias and self-protection. It is architecturally required. The narcissistic structure cannot acknowledge certain things about itself without the entire edifice of its psychological organization being threatened. The dependency, the internal emptiness, the degree to which its functioning relies on external regulation. These cannot be brought into conscious awareness without activating the confrontation with the shadow that the narcissistic structure was built to avoid. So they are managed through the construction and maintenance of an alternative version of reality. A version in which the empath is the confused one, the unreliable one, the one whose perception of the dynamic is distorted by psychological limitation, the one whose experience of what happened does not accurately describe what happened. This alternative reality requires the empath's silence to maintain itself, not the empath's agreement. The narcissistic structure can manage disagreement. Disagreement is engagement, and engagement provides projection surfaces and the confirmation of the dynamic's central organizing principle. What the alternative reality cannot survive is the empath's clear, grounded, undefended narration of their own experience. Not as accusation, not as an attempt to convince the narcissist that their version is wrong, simply as the empath's account of what they experienced. I felt what I felt. I saw what I saw. I know what I know. This is what happened from where I was standing. The alternative reality, maintained through the narcissist's authoritative insistence and the empath's learned silence, encounters the empath's voice and finds it cannot be maintained in the presence of someone who is speaking their own truth clearly and from their own center. Not because the truth defeats the alternative reality in some logical confrontation, but because the alternative reality requires the empath's silence to occupy the space where the empath's own account would be. The empath's voice fills that space, and the alternative reality has nowhere to exist. The third thing the narcissistic structure loses when the empath finds their voice is perhaps the most structurally significant. It loses the dynamic itself. Jung observed that the narcissistic dynamic is not merely a pattern of behavior. It is a specific kind of relational field, a psychological environment produced by the interaction between the narcissistic structure's compulsive need for external regulation and the empath's compulsive tendency to provide it. This field requires both participants to be in specific psychological positions for it to function. The narcissistic structure must be organized around its own internal state as the primary reality of the relationship. The empath must be organized around the narcissistic structure's internal state as the primary reality of the relationship. When both participants are in these positions simultaneously, the dynamic functions. The narcissist's shadow is projected and absorbed. The empath's psychological resources are extracted and consumed. The regulatory function the narcissistic structure requires is performed continuously by the empaths organized around the narcissist's psychological stance. When the empath finds their voice, when they speak from their own center, when they narrate their own experience, when they name what they perceive with the specific quality of grounded, undefended self-expression that the individuation process produces, they are no longer in the position the dynamic requires them to occupy. They are no longer organized around the narcissistic structure's internal state as the primary reality. They are organized around their own. And the dynamic, the specific relational field produced by the two participants' simultaneous occupation of their required positions, collapses. Not dramatically, not through confrontation, not through the empath forcing the narcissist to acknowledge anything or change anything or face anything they are not ready to face. Simply through the empath's occupation of their own psychological center. Simply through the voice. Jung was interested not only in what the narcissist loses when the empath finds their voice, but in what the empath gains. Because the voice, in Jung's framework, is not merely a communication tool. It is not primarily about what is said, or to whom, or with what effect. The voice is the expression of the relationship between the ego and the self. The individuated empath who speaks from their own center is not merely communicating information. They are performing, in the act of speaking, the specific psychological function that individuation requires, the function of the ego, giving expression to what the deeper self knows. The psyche's relationship with itself made audible. This is why the voice that the empath finds through the individuation process sounds different from the voice they may have had before the relationship, or before the specific process of differentiation the relationship catalyzed. It is not louder. It may actually be quieter. It is not more certain in the social sense, Not more assertive, not more confident in the performative way that confidence is often displayed. It is more grounded, more present to itself, more free of the specific quality of tentativeness, the checking, the modifying, the organizing of what is about to be said around the anticipated response, that characterize the pre-individuated empath's voice. The individuated voice does not check. It does not modify for anticipated response. It does not organize what it is about to say around the question of how it will land. It simply speaks. From the center. What is true? What is perceived? What is known? And this quality, this specific, undefended, centered quality of speech, is not a skill that can be taught or a technique that can be learned. It is the natural expression of a psyche that has completed enough of the individuation process to speak from itself rather than from the periphery of another's world. There is a specific quality to the empath's voice when it is first found that Jung documented with care, and that the empath who is in the process of finding it may recognize. It is not comfortable. Not at first. The voice that has been suppressed, organized into silence through the accumulated experience of having authentic expression, met with denial, reframing, or the narcissistic structure's authoritative override, does not emerge as a polished, fluent, confidence-filled expression. It emerges initially with the specific quality of something that has been held down for a long time and is finding its way to the surface. It may shake. It may be uncertain about its right to speak at all. It may find itself immediately assailed by the familiar internal voices, the accumulated residue of years of having one's experience contradicted, that insist the perception is wrong, the feeling is disproportionate, the speaking of this particular truth is a mistake. Jung observed that this internal assailing is not evidence that the voice is wrong. It is evidence that the voice is right. The internal voices that arise to undermine the empath's first authentic expressions are not wisdom. They are the installed reflex of the narcissistic dynamic, the internalized version of the authoritative narrative that was applied from outside for so long that it has become an internal structure. The empath who hears these voices and speaks anyway, who allows the shakiness, acknowledges the uncertainty, and speaks from their center regardless, is not performing courage. They are enacting individuation. They are doing exactly what Jung documented as the specific work the ego must do in its relationship with the self, to give expression to what the deeper layers of the psyche know, even when the expression is uncomfortable, even when it is uncertain, even when every installed reflex insists that speaking is dangerous. The voice finds its strength through use. Not through preparation, not through rehearsal, not through the development of sufficient confidence before attempting the first authentic expression. Through the act of speaking itself. Each time the empath speaks from their own center, each time they name what they perceive, articulate what they feel, give voice to what the body knows, the voice becomes more itself, more grounded, more capable of speaking without the checking, without the modification for anticipated response, without the organized around the other quality that characterized the silenced version. What does finding the voice look like in practice? Jung was careful to resist prescriptive frameworks. The individuation process is not a protocol, and the empath's voice does not emerge on a schedule or through a specific sequence of steps. But he documented certain characteristics of the voice-finding process that are worth attending to. The first is that the voice begins internally, before it is ever expressed externally. The empath finds their voice first in the interior, in the private, unspoken acknowledgement of what they perceive and feel and know, in the quiet, internal act of allowing their own experience to be their own experience, without immediately submitting it to the narcissist's version of what it should be. This internal voice is the foundation. The external expression, the speaking of what is perceived to the narcissist or to others or to the world, is the culmination of a process that begins in the private relationship between the empath and their own inner life. And this sequencing matters because it means that the voice is not dependent on the narcissist's response. The empath does not need the narcissist to acknowledge the truth of what is spoken for the speaking to have done its work. The work is done in the speaking. in the act of giving expression to what is known, in the restoration of the channel between the ego and the self, that the narcissistic dynamic was organized to block. Whether the narcissist hears, acknowledges, validates, or dismisses what is said, the voice has been found. The speaking has been done, and once found, it cannot be unfound. The second characteristic Jung documented is that the voice, when genuinely found, is not primarily directed at the narcissist. This is one of the most significant distinctions between the empath's authentic voice and the reactive speaking that the dynamic sometimes produces. The speaking that arises not from the empath's own center, but from the accumulated frustration of the dynamic, the desire to finally make the narcissist understand, the urgent need to have the experience acknowledged. Reactive speaking is organized around the narcissist. It requires the narcissist's response, the acknowledgement, the validation, the change in behavior, to complete its function. And because the narcissistic structure is structurally incapable of providing this, reactive speaking typically produces escalation rather than resolution. The empath speaks in the hope of being heard. The narcissist deploys one of the available mechanisms: denial, reframing, the authoritative counter-narrative, and the empath, whose speaking was organized around the narcissist's response, is left more depleted than before. The authentic voice is different. It is organized around the empath's own truth. It speaks because speaking is what integrity requires, because the empath's relationship with their own inner life demands that what is known be given expression. Not to convince the narcissist, not to change the dynamic, not to produce acknowledgement, to honor the truth of the experience, to complete the channel between what is known and what is spoken, to be in the fullest psychological sense a person who can say what they experience. This voice does not require the narcissist's response to be complete. It is complete in its own speaking. And this completeness, this quality of expression that requires nothing from outside to fulfill its function, is precisely what the narcissistic structure has no mechanism to engage. Because every mechanism the narcissistic structure possesses was designed to manage a speaking that requires response. The authentic voice requires none. Jung observed something about the effect of the empath's authentic voice on the narcissistic structure that is counterintuitive and worth examining carefully. He observed that the empath's authentic voice does not produce the confrontation the narcissistic structure was organized to expect. The narcissistic structure, encountering the empath's early attempts at authentic expression, typically responds with escalation, with the deployment of the mechanisms designed to undermine the speaking, to return the empath to the organized around the narcissist position that the dynamic requires. The denial, the reframing, the authoritative counter-narrative, the sudden vulnerability that redirects the empath's attention to the narcissist's distress, the rage that reframes the empath's speaking as an attack rather than an expression. These mechanisms are designed for a specific kind of speaking, the reactive speaking organized around the narcissist's response. They are designed to engage the empath's need to have their speaking received. But the authentic voice, the voice that speaks from the empath's own center and requires nothing from the narcissist's response to be complete, does not provide the engagement these mechanisms require. The denial finds no anxiety in the empath that it can amplify. The reframing finds no self-doubt in the empath that it can exploit. The authoritative counter-narrative finds no dependence on validation in the empath that it can leverage. The authentic voice simply continues. Not loudly, not insistently, not in the reactive, escalating pattern that the narcissistic structure's mechanisms are designed to produce. Simply present. Simply itself. Simply speaking what it knows from the place it knows it from. And the narcissistic structure, encountering this specific quality of speaking, finding none of the engagement its mechanisms require, begins to lose the one thing its engagement with the empath was organized to secure. The empath's organized around the narcissist's psychological orientation, the center. This is the deepest loss the narcissistic structure experiences when the empath finds their voice. Not the loss of a communication advantage, not the loss of the ability to maintain the alternative reality without challenge, not even the loss of the projection surface, the loss of the empath center. Jung observed that the narcissistic dynamic requires, at its foundation, that the empath's psychological center be located outside the empath, organized around the narcissist's internal state, responsive to the narcissist's regulatory needs, available for the narcissist's shadow projections. The empath's voice, the authentic, self-sourced, centered expression of what the empath actually experiences, is the most direct evidence that the empath center has moved, that it has returned to the empath, that the psychological orientation that the dynamic required, the organized around the narcissist stance that made all of the narcissistic structure's operations possible, has been replaced by something the narcissistic structure cannot work with. An empath who is organized around their own center. Who speaks from that center? Who names what they perceive from that center? Who exists, in the most fundamental psychological sense, as a person whose primary psychological orientation is toward their own inner life, rather than toward the management of the narcissists. This empath, this voiced, centered, self-organized empath, is simply not available for the dynamic. Not because they have decided to refuse the dynamic, not because they have constructed defenses against it, but because the specific psychological position the dynamic required them to occupy has been vacated. They are no longer there. They are here, in themselves, speaking from themselves. And the narcissistic structure, reaching for the empath it knew, the one organized around the narcissist's center, available for the narcissist's projections, silenced into the absorption that the dynamic required, finds that this person no longer exists. In their place is someone who has found their voice, and with it, everything the voice was always the expression of. The self returned, speaking, for the empath who is in the process of finding their voice, who can feel the authentic expression beginning to emerge, uncertain and shaky and not yet fully formed. Jung's framework offers something important. Permission. Not the permission of an external authority, the permission that comes from understanding. From knowing that the voice that is emerging, however uncertain, however much it is assailed by the internalized narrative that insists it should be silent, is not a mistake, is not an overreaction, is not the product of a psychological limitation that needs to be corrected before the expression is valid. It is individuation doing what individuation does. The psyche returning to itself through the specific act of giving expression to what it knows. The channel between ego and self being reopened, one authentic utterance at a time. This is not comfortable. Jung was never interested in comfort as a measure of whether the individuation process was proceeding correctly. Some of the most significant movements in the individuation process, the moments when the psyche makes the most profound return toward wholeness, are among the most uncomfortable experiences the conscious mind undergoes. Finding the voice after years of learned silence is exactly this kind of moment. It shakes. It is uncertain. It is immediately assailed by everything the dynamic installed to keep it quiet. And it is nonetheless exactly what the individuation process requires. Exactly what the self has been waiting for the ego to do. Exactly what will, over time and with the specific kind of patient practice that individuation requires, produce the grounded, centered, self-organized voice that the narcissistic structure cannot silence and cannot work with. The voice that speaks not from the periphery of another's world, but from the center of one's own. Jung returned always to the same question. Not what is comfortable, not what is strategically effective, not what will produce the desired response from the narcissistic structure or any other external audience. What does the psyche require for genuine wholeness? And the answer, in the context of the empath's voice, is simple. To be spoken. The psyche that has organized itself around silence, that has suppressed authentic expression in the service of maintaining a dynamic that required it, is a psyche that has been separated from one of its most essential functions. The function of giving expression to what is known, of making the interior world audible at least to itself. of completing the loop between what is perceived and what is spoken, between what is felt and what is named, between what the self knows and what the ego gives voice to. The empath who finds their voice does not merely change their communication pattern. They restore a function that is fundamental to psychological wholeness. And in restoring that function, in allowing the voice to emerge, however shakily, however uncertainly, however much it is assailed by the internalized residue of years of systematic silencing, the empath is not just recovering their voice. They are recovering themselves. The self speaking at last. Through the one channel, the narcissistic dynamic was most urgently organized to keep closed. The empath's own mouth, saying what is true, from the place where the truth lives. The center, which was always there, waiting for the voice to find it. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark, one awakened mind helping another remember. Together we move beyond the dark.